What happens when a power-hungry cop decides to put a black woman in handcuffs over nothing, only to realize she is the state attorney who can destroy his entire career? Watch closely, because this is the moment arrogance meets the one person it should have feared. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The late afternoon sun stretched long streaks of amber across the polished concrete of the executive parking structure, casting sharp reflections along the rows of high-end vehicles lined with near-military precision. Danielle Brooks walked with measured calm between them, her heels striking the ground in a steady, unhurried rhythm that echoed softly through the open space. She carried a leather portfolio tucked neatly under her arm, her posture upright, her expression composed in a way that spoke of someone used to pressure but never ruled by it. To anyone passing by, she appeared to be just another professional wrapping up a long day, another face among many in a city that rarely paused to notice individuals. Yet there was a quiet deliberateness in her movements, the kind that came from years of navigating rooms where every word mattered and every decision carried weight far beyond the moment. She reached her vehicle, a sleek black sedan that reflected the fading light like glass, and paused briefly, scanning her surroundings out of habit rather than fear. A distant car door slammed somewhere across the structure, followed by the low hum of an engine turning over. The air carried a faint mix of rubber, oil, and the lingering heat of the day, creating a stillness that felt ordinary, almost forgettable. Danielle set her portfolio on the passenger seat after unlocking the door, her fingers brushing against a stack of neatly organized documents, each one representing cases, decisions, and responsibilities she carried without ever needing to announce them. She exhaled slowly, allowing herself a rare moment of quiet before the evening ahead. Her phone buzzed once inside her bag, but she ignored it for now, choosing instead to savor the brief pause between obligations. Above her, the structure's overhead lights flickered on one by one, bathing the area in a cool, artificial glow that replaced the warmth of the sun. It was in that subtle shift, in that quiet transition from day to night, that something unseen began to change. Not in her posture, not in her expression, but somewhere beyond her immediate awareness, where assumptions were already forming and decisions were being made without her consent. Danielle closed the car door gently, the sound crisp and controlled, and rested her hand for a moment on the roof of the vehicle, unaware that in just minutes, the calm she carried would be tested by someone who saw her not for who she was, but for what he had already decided she must be. And in that misjudgment, the stage was set for a collision between false authority and the kind of power that does not need to raise its voice to be felt. The faint echo of footsteps approached from behind, deliberate and unhurried, the kind that carried an expectation of control long before a word was ever spoken. Danielle sensed it before she turned, that subtle shift in atmosphere, like a shadow stretching across something that had moments ago been undisturbed. "Ma'am," a voice cut through the quiet, sharp and edged with suspicion. "Step away from the vehicle." Danielle turned slowly, her expression composed, eyes steady as they landed on Officer Kyle Brennan. His posture was rigid, chest slightly puffed, one hand resting near his belt as if proximity alone granted him authority over everything within reach. The overhead lights caught the hard lines of his face, emphasizing the narrow gaze he fixed on her, already filled with conclusions he had not bothered to question. A few steps behind him stood Officer Luke Harris, less certain, his eyes flicking between Danielle and Brennan, as though trying to read a situation that was already slipping beyond reason. Danielle straightened slightly, closing her car door with quiet precision before facing Brennan fully. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her tone even, controlled, each word placed carefully. Brennan's lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes sweeping over her, her car, the polished exterior, the interior visible through the window. "Yeah, there is," he replied, his voice carrying just enough volume to establish dominance. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this structure. You mind telling me what you're doing here?" Danielle held his gaze, unflinching. I just finished work. I'm leaving, she said simply, gesturing lightly toward the vehicle. Brennan let out a low breath through his nose, something between irritation and disbelief. That's so, he said, taking a step closer, invading her space in a way that was calculated, intentional. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you were lingering around a vehicle that might not belong to you. Harris shifted slightly behind him, his boots scraping faintly against the concrete, but he said nothing. Danielle's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, though her voice remained steady. This is my car. Brennan tilted his head, studying her with exaggerated skepticism, as if weighing her words against a narrative he had already chosen. Then you won't have a problem showing me some identification, he said, extending his hand, palm up, the gesture less a request and more demand. Danielle paused for a fraction of a second, not out of hesitation, but calculation. She reached into her bag, slowly, deliberately, pulling out her wallet and handing over her driver's license without a word. Brennan snatched it with a quick motion, glancing down briefly before looking back at her, unimpressed. Step away from the car, he repeated, more forcefully this time, nodding toward the open space beside her. Danielle complied without argument, taking a measured step back, her hands visible at her sides. The tension in the air thickened, not from chaos, but from the quiet imbalance of power Brennan believed he held. He circled slightly, positioning himself between her and the driver's side door, his movements controlled but aggressive in their intent. Pop the trunk, he said abruptly. Danielle's brows drew together, just slightly. On what grounds? She asked, her tone still calm, though now edged with something firmer. Brennan's expression hardened, his jaw clenching as her question landed like a challenge. On the grounds that I said so, he snapped, the restraint in his voice thinning. Harris glanced at him, unease flickering across his face, but again, he remained silent. Brennan took another step forward, closing the gap once more, his presence looming. Or we can do this the hard way, he added, his voice dropping lower, more dangerous, as the situation began to tip from routine into something far more volatile. Danielle did not move immediately, and that pause, brief as it was, seemed to irritate Brennan more than outright defiance ever could. Her eyes remained fixed on his, steady and unreadable, as if she were measuring him rather than reacting to him. Officer, she said, her voice controlled, carrying a quiet authority that did not match the role he had already assigned her. You do not have probable cause to search my vehicle. Brennan's jaw flexed, a muscle tightening near his temple as her words landed with precision. It was not just what she said, it was how she said it, calm, certain, unshaken. It chipped at the image he was trying to construct, and he did not like that. I don't need a lecture, he shot back, his tone rising, sharp enough to echo faintly off the concrete walls. You're being detained. Now, pop the trunk. Danielle's posture did not change. Her shoulders remained relaxed, her hands visible, her breathing even. On what specific charge? She asked, the question cutting through his demand with surgical clarity. Harris shifted again behind Brennan, his gaze dropping briefly to the ground before lifting back up, uncertainty now more visible in the way his stance faltered. Brennan noticed, and it only seemed to harden him further. He took another step forward, close enough now that the space between them felt intentionally compressed, his presence pressing in like a wall. You fit the description, he said, though the words came out thin, unsupported. We've had reports. That's enough. Danielle tilted her head slightly, not in submission, but in quiet disbelief. A description of what exactly? She asked, her tone still even, though now there was a sharper edge beneath it, something that hinted she was no longer simply complying, but documenting, cataloging. Brennan's fingers tapped once against his belt, an unconscious rhythm that betrayed the irritation building beneath his surface. You're asking too many questions, he said, his voice dropping lower, more controlled, but no less aggressive. People who have nothing to hide don't act like this. Danielle held his gaze without blinking. People who understand their rights do, she replied. The words hung in the air between them, quiet but immovable. For a moment, the structure seemed to shrink around them, the hum of distant engines fading into the background as the confrontation sharpened into something more defined. Brennan's expression shifted, not into doubt, but into something more rigid, more defensive. The kind of reaction that came when authority was not being accepted without resistance. He turned slightly, gesturing toward the car with a quick, impatient motion. "Open it," he repeated, louder now, as if volume alone could override the lack of justification. Danielle did not move toward the vehicle. Instead, she remained exactly where she stood, her composure unbroken, her silence now more powerful than any argument. Harris cleared his throat quietly, stepping half a pace forward. "Kyle," he murmured, low enough that it almost blended into the ambient noise. "Maybe we should—" Brennan cut him off with a sharp glance, the kind that silenced more effectively than words. "Stay out of it," he snapped, not taking his eyes off Danielle. Then, without warning, his hand reached out, not to guide, but to control, fingers closing around her upper arm with firm, unnecessary force. "You're not going anywhere until I say you are," he added, his grip tightening just enough to assert dominance. Danielle did not pull away. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked down briefly at his hand on her arm, then back up at him, her expression unchanged, but her eyes now carrying something new, something colder, something that suggested the line he had just crossed would not be ignored. The moment lingered, stretched thin between them, Brennan's hand still clamped around Danielle's arm, his grip firm in a way that had nothing to do with procedure and everything to do with control. Danielle slowly lifted her gaze to meet his again, her expression unchanged, but there was a sharpened clarity behind her eyes now, as if something had quietly shifted from tolerance to resolve. "You need to remove your hand," she said, her voice low, precise, each word delivered without strain. Brennan did not move. If anything, his fingers tightened slightly, the pressure deliberate, a silent challenge. "You don't give the orders here," he replied, his tone edged with irritation that was beginning to slip into something more volatile. "Edo." Danielle held a stare, unflinching. "Then you should start acting within the limits of that authority," she answered, her calmness cutting through his aggression like glass. That did it. Brennan's composure fractured just enough for it to show, a brief tightening around his eyes, a flicker of something that looked dangerously close to being personal. He released her arm abruptly, but only to step back half a pace and square his shoulders, as if resetting his stance before escalating further. "All right," he said, drawing the word out, his voice now louder, more performative, as though aware of the few distant figures, beginning to glance in their direction. "Since you want to make this difficult, we're going to do this properly." Harris shifted again, more noticeably this time. "Kyle, we don't have—" "I said stay out of it," Brennan snapped, not even turning his head. His focus remained locked on Danielle, who stood exactly where she had been, neither retreating nor advancing, her presence steady in a way that only seemed to provoke him more. Brennan reached for his radio, his movements sharp, clipped. "Dispatch, this is Unit 27, he said, his voice firm, controlled. "I've got a suspicious individual refusing lawful commands in the executive parking structure on Peachtree. Possible vehicle theft situation. Requesting confirmation on vehicle registration." The words hung in the air, each one carefully chosen to justify what had not yet been justified. Danielle listened without interruption, her face giving nothing away, though her attention was now fully engaged, every detail being noted, every overreach quietly recorded in her mind. Brennan lowered the radio, watching her closely, as if expecting some visible reaction, some crack in the composure that had thus far denied him the satisfaction of control. When none came, his expression hardened further. "Turn around," he ordered abruptly. Danielle did not move. "On what basis?" she asked again, her tone unchanged, though now unmistakably firm. Brennan let out a breath that bordered on a scoff. "Obstruction," he said. "Failure to comply. You wanted to keep listing them." Danielle's gaze did not waver. "You are escalating without cause," she replied, her voice steady, carrying a quiet authority that stood in stark contrast to his rising aggression. That contrast seemed to irritate him more than anything else. He stepped forward again, closing the distance with a suddenness that shifted the energy entirely. His hand reached for her wrist this time, faster, more decisive, attempting to pull her arm behind her back. I said turn around. He barked, the command no longer disguised as procedure. Harris took a step forward, tension visible in his posture now. Kyle, wait. But Brennan was already moving, already committed, his actions driven less by protocol and more by the need to assert control over a situation that refused to bend. Danielle allowed the movement, not resisting, not struggling, her body remaining composed even as her arm was guided behind her. But her eyes, fixed forward, carried that same cold steadiness, as if she understood exactly where this path would lead and had already decided to let him walk it. Danielle's arm was guided firmly behind her back, her wrist held in Brennan's grip as he forced her into position with a sharp, practiced motion that carried more aggression than necessity. The cold night air seemed to tighten around them as the overhead lights cast stark shadows across the concrete, turning the moment into something harsh and exposed. "You're under detention," Brennan declared loudly, his voice carrying across the structure as if announcing authority to anyone within earshot. Failure to comply and obstruction. Danielle did not resist. Her posture remained upright, her balance steady even as her other arm was pulled back to meet the first. The faint clink of metal followed, unmistakable and final, as the cuffs locked around her wrists. The sound echoed longer than it should have, sharp and absolute. A few people at the far end of the structure had stopped walking, their attention drawn now, phones subtly raised, curiosity mixing with discomfort. Brennan adjusted his stance, keeping hold of her arm as he turned her slightly, positioning her against the side of the vehicle. The gesture was controlled but forceful, his hand pressing against her shoulder to keep her in place. "Should have just listened," he muttered, close enough now that only she could hear the edge in his voice. Danielle's cheek turned slightly toward the cool surface of the car, but her expression did not fracture. Her breathing remained even, her gaze focused forward, as though this moment, however unjust, had already been accounted for in her mind. "You are making a mistake," she said quietly, not as a plea, but as a statement. Brennan let out a short breath, almost amused, though there was no humor in it. "Yeah," he replied, tightening his grip briefly before stepping back just enough to look at her fully. "That's what they all say." Harris stood a few feet away now, his unease no longer subtle. His eyes moved from Danielle's restrained posture to Brennan's rigid stance, then to the small gathering of onlookers. "Kyle, this is getting out of hand," he said, his voice low but urgent. Brennan did not even glance at him. "It's handled," he shot back, dismissive, already turning his attention back to Danielle as if sealing the situation in his favor. He reached for his radio again. "Dispatch. Suspect is detained," he said, his tone clipped, professional on the surface but carrying an undercurrent of satisfaction. "Cuffs applied. Awaiting vehicle confirmation." Danielle closed her eyes briefly, not in defeat, but in calculation, then opened them again, her focus sharpening. "Officer Brennan," she said, her voice steady despite the position she was in, "I'm going to ask you one more time to reconsider what you are doing." The use of his name caught him off guard for a fraction of a second, but it only hardened his expression further. "Too late for that," he replied, his voice flattening into something colder. "You should have thought about that before you started acting suspicious." Danielle shifted her weight slightly, testing the tension of the cuffs, not to break free, but to settle into a more stable stance. Even restrained, there was no sense of panic in her movements, only control. "Then I suggest," she continued, her tone unchanged, "that you pay very close attention to what happens next." Brennan's lips curled faintly, dismissive, unconvinced. To him, this was already over. The situation was contained, the narrative established, the outcome certain. He had no idea that in locking those cuffs, he had not secured control, but triggered the very moment that would begin to unravel everything he believed he commanded. The air seemed to settle into a strange stillness after Danielle's words, as if even the structure itself was waiting to see what Brennan would do next. He adjusted his grip on her arm, less out of necessity now and more out of habit, his authority already asserted, his decision already made. "What happens next," he said slowly, almost mocking, "is you get processed like anyone else who thinks they can play games out here." He reached toward his belt, pulling out a small notepad, flipping it open with a practice motion. The scratch of his pen against paper broke the silence, sharp and deliberate, as he began jotting down notes, constructing his version of events line by line. Danielle remained still against the car, the metal cool against her shoulder, her hands secured behind her, but there was nothing passive in her presence. Her gaze lifted slightly, watching him with a quiet focus that suggested she was not following his lead, but allowing him to reveal himself completely. "You are documenting a false arrest," she said, her voice calm, measured, each word landing with quiet precision. Brennan did not look up. "I'm documenting exactly what I see," he replied, his tone dismissive, the pen continuing its steady movement. "Suspicious behavior, refusal to comply, escalation." Harris shifted closer now, his voice lower, more urgent. "Kyle, maybe we should run the plate first before." Brennan snapped the notebook shut mid-sentence, the sound cutting through Harris's words. "I said I've got it," he interrupted, irritation flaring again. "You want to second-guess me? You can write your own report." Harris fell silent, though his expression tightened, the unease now unmistakable. Brennan turned back to Danielle, slipping the notepad away and stepping closer again, his presence looming as he reached toward her bag still resting inside the open car door. "Since you're not being helpful," he said, pulling the bag out and placing on the hood with a firm motion, "I'll find what I need myself." Danielle's eyes followed the movement briefly, then returned to him. "Do not open that," she said, her voice low, controlled, carrying a weight that was no longer just caution but warning. Brennan paused for half a second, just enough for the tension to register, then let out a faint, dismissive breath. "Or what?" he asked, glancing at her with a thin smile that never reached his eyes. "You gonna file a complaint?" The sarcasm in his voice was heavy, layered with the confidence of someone who had never been meaningfully challenged. Danielle held his gaze, unwavering. "No," she said quietly. "I'm going to give you one last opportunity to stop before this becomes something you cannot walk away from." The words settled between them, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute in their certainty. For a brief moment, even Harris seemed to hold his breath. Brennan studied her, searching for something, fear, hesitation, anything that would confirm his version of control. He found none. Instead of reconsidering, his expression hardened, that same rigid confidence snapping back into place like armor. A short, dry chuckle escaped him, humorless and sharp. "You're in no position to be giving anyone opportunities," he said, shaking his head slightly, as if dismissing the entire warning. Then, without another word, he unzipped the bag, his hands moving with deliberate defiance, as though crossing a line simply to prove that he could. In that moment, with the zipper pulled open and the final warning ignored, Brennan did not just continue the situation. He sealed it, closing off the last exit he would ever have from the consequences already beginning to take shape around him. Brennan's fingers moved through the contents of the bag with a careless confidence that had defined every step he had taken so far. Papers shifting, a phone sliding against leather, the faint rustle of organized documents disturbed without permission. Then his hand paused, just for a second. His brow tightened slightly as he pulled out a slim, dark case, heavier than the rest, its surface smooth, official. He flipped it open with the same dismissive motion he had used for everything else, expecting nothing. What he saw did not register at first. The overhead lights reflected off the badge inside, polished, unmistakable, accompanied by credentials that carried a weight far beyond the parking structure. His eyes scanned it once, then again, slower this time. The change was immediate, though subtle at first, the rigid certainty in his posture faltering, the line of his shoulders losing that sharp edge. Harris stepped closer, drawn by the shift, his own gaze dropping to the open case in Brennan's hand. "Kyle," he murmured, but this time there was no hesitation in his voice, only a quiet alarm. Brennan did not respond. His eyes remained locked on the identification, his grip tightening slightly around it, as if the object itself might change if he held it differently. Danielle's voice broke the silence, calm, steady, no longer warning, no longer asking. "Read it carefully." Brennan's throat moved as he swallowed, the motion small but visible. He did not want to look up. Not yet, because the moment he did, the reality of what he had done would no longer be contained within the lines of a badge. "State attorney," he said under his breath, the words uneven, as though unfamiliar in his own mouth. Harris exhaled sharply, stepping back half a pace, his face draining of color as the full weight of it settled in. Danielle remained exactly where she was, her hands still cuffed behind her back, her posture unchanged, but now the balance in the space had shifted completely. She was no longer the one being evaluated. Brennan finally lifted his head. His eyes met hers, and for the first time since he had approached her, there was no authority in them, no certainty, only the dawning realization of a mistake that could not be undone. "If," he started, but the words faltered, his voice catching as his mind struggled to reconcile the image he had constructed with the truth now in his hands. Danielle held his gaze, unblinking. "Yes," she said quietly. The single word carried more weight than anything that had come before it. The structure felt different now, the same concrete, the same lights, but the air had shifted, heavy in a way that pressed down on Brennan's chest. His hand moved instinctively, as if to close the badge, to hide it, to reverse the moment, but it was too late. The onlookers at the far end had drawn closer, their attention sharpened, sensing the change, even if they did not yet understand it. Harris took another step back, creating distance, as though proximity alone might implicate him further. Brennan's breathing changed, shallow now, uneven. His gaze flicked briefly to the cuffs on Danielle's wrists, then back to her face, the reality of that single action settling in with crushing clarity. "I didn't," he began again, but there was no sentence that could follow, no explanation that could bridge what had already happened. Danielle's expression did not soften. If anything, it grew more resolute. "You didn't know?" She finished for him, her tone calm but absolute. "That does not change what you did." The words landed with finality, and in that moment, Brennan understood that the control he thought he held had never been his. It had only been borrowed, and now, in the space of single revelation, it had been taken back entirely. The silence that followed Danielle's final words did not last long. The distant hum of engines was quickly overtaken by something sharper, more urgent, the unmistakable sound of multiple vehicles entering the structure at speed. Headlights cut through the dim concrete levels, beams sweeping across pillars and parked cars as two black SUVs rolled in, followed closely by a marked patrol unit. The sudden arrival shifted the atmosphere completely, drawing the attention of every onlooker and freezing Brennan where he stood. His hand still held her badge case, but now it trembled slightly, the confidence that once guided his every movement replaced by something far more fragile. The lead SUV came to a stop just feet away, doors opening in quick succession. Chief Raymond Cole stepped out first, his presence commanding in a way that required no raised voice. His eyes moved immediately to the scene, taking in the handcuffs, Danielle's restrained posture, Brennan's rigid stance. The temperature in the air seemed to drop. "What is going on here?" Cole's voice was low, controlled, but carried a weight that silenced everything else. No one answered immediately. Brennan opened his mouth, then closed it again, the words refusing to come together. Harris stepped forward instead, his voice tight. "Sir, there's been a mistake." Cole's gaze shifted to Danielle, recognition flashing instantly, followed by something far more serious. "Ma'am," he said, stepping closer, his tone changing with immediate respect. "Are you all right?" Danielle met his eyes, her composure unbroken despite the cuffs still secured around her wrists. "I will be," she replied evenly, "once these are removed." The request did not sound like one. It sounded like a conclusion already reached. Cole did not hesitate. "Now," he said sharply, turning to Brennan. That single word carried more authority than every command Brennan had issued combined. Brennan fumbled slightly, stepping forward, his hands no longer steady as he reached for the cuffs. The metallic release clicked open, but this time the sound did not echo with control, it echoed with consequence. Danielle brought her hands forward slowly, rubbing her wrists once, not out of pain, but out of principle, as if reclaiming something that had been taken without cause. Cole turned back to Brennan, his expression hardening into something unmistakable. "Badge," he said. Brennan blinked, the word hitting him harder than anything else. "Sir, your badge," Cole repeated, sharper now, leaving no room for delay. Brennan's hand moved to his chest almost automatically, unclipping the badge that had defined his authority moments ago. He hesitated for half a second before placing it into Cole's outstretched hand, the gesture small but devastating in its finality. Around them, the onlookers who had once watched in quiet uncertainty now witnessed the reversal, whispers spreading as phones continued to record. Cole glanced at Harris next, his voice cutting through the tension. "You will file a full report. Every detail." Immediately, Harris nodded quickly, relief and dread mixing in his expression. Then Cole turned back to Danielle, his tone respectful, measured. "This will be addressed at the highest level," he said. Danielle gave a slight nod, her gaze shifting briefly toward Brennan, who now stood motionless, his posture no longer rigid, but hollow, as if the structure that held him upright had collapsed from within. The power he had worn so easily minutes ago was gone, stripped away in front of witnesses, replaced by the weight of what he had done. And for the first time, there was nothing left for him to hide behind. The structure slowly returned to its natural rhythm, the tension that had once gripped every corner dissolving into something quieter, something steadier. The flashing lights dimmed as the vehicles powered down, their presence no longer urgent, no longer needed to command attention. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, the earlier spectacle now settling into memory, but the shift in energy remained undeniable. Danielle stood beside her car, her posture composed, her movements unhurried as she adjusted the sleeve of her blazer, smoothing the fabric with deliberate care. There was no rush in her actions, no trace of the chaos that had just unfolded, only a quiet restoration of order, as though she were placing everything back where it belonged. Chief Cole remained nearby, speaking in low, controlled tones with another arriving officer, his gaze occasionally flicking toward Brennan, who now stood off to the side, separated from the scene in a way that was both physical and symbolic. His shoulders, once squared with certainty, now sagged slightly, his eyes lowered, avoiding the glances that passed over him. There was no defiance left, no attempt to reclaim authority, only the weight of consequence settling in with each passing second. Harris stood a few feet away, his report already beginning in hurried notes, his earlier hesitation replaced by a quiet determination to document everything with precision. The system that had been bent moments ago was already correcting itself. Danielle reached into her car, retrieving her portfolio, placing it neatly back under her arm. She paused briefly, her hand resting against the door frame, her gaze lifting to meet Chief Cole's as he approached. "Ma'am," he said, his tone respectful, measured, "this will be handled fully. You have my word." Danielle studied him for a moment, then gave a slight nod, not as acceptance, but as acknowledgement. "Make sure it is," she replied, her voice calm, steady, carrying the same quiet authority that had never left her. Cole inclined his head, understanding the weight behind those words. There would be no oversight, no dismissal, no quiet resolution hidden from view. This would be addressed properly and completely. Danielle closed the car door with a soft, definitive sound, then moved toward the driver's side. As she opened it, The faint creak of the hinge echoed lightly, a small, ordinary sound that contrasted sharply with everything that had come before. She paused once more before getting in, her gaze briefly sweeping the structure, not in suspicion, but in quiet reflection. Then, without another word, she stepped inside. The engine started smoothly, the low hum steady and controlled. As the vehicle pulled away, its headlights cutting clean lines across the concrete, the space it left behind felt different, lighter, as though something heavy had been removed. Brennan remained where he was, watching the car disappear into the ramp leading out, the reality of the moment settling deeper with each second. He did not move. He did not speak. There was nothing left to assert, nothing left to hold on to. And as the sound of the engine faded into the distance, what remained was not silence, but a quiet, undeniable truth that power, when abused, does not endure, and justice, when carried with calm resolve, does not need to announce itself to be felt.